The Hippocratic Oath. It's a promise every doctor makes before being handed a license. Now, we want to trust our doctors, of course. It's human nature, it's the American way. But that covenant is being increasingly betrayed, that level of trust. It's not always through malice, and it's not at the individual doctor level, but more through institutionalized greed, propaganda, and hubris. And when that certainty partners with government power and the deep pockets of one of the most profitable industries on earth, what you get is not public health. Instead, you get something much closer to medical tyranny. And that is why informed consent is so very critical today. Now, this series is about what has happened to informed consent in America. We're going to ask some simple questions. For example, what if doctors themselves are the victims of indoctrination, often without knowing it? Why are vaccine manufacturers legally immune from any liability as countless vaccine-injured families, most of whom we don't even hear about, bear the emotional and financial burden alone? Why is the phrase safe and effective used to silence dissent as the most vaccinated nation on earth, us, leads the developed world in chronic disease? This is an existential crisis unfolding, folks. Industry growth, high stock prices, all of that is coming at the expense of the human condition. So join Dr. Richard and me today as we welcome investigative journalist Jeremy Hammond. Jeremy's incredible forensic work has documented how informed consent has all but disappeared in America, and it's been by design. Okay? Now, we're not here to tell you what to think, but we are here to give you something desperately needed, the information to be part of your own health decisions. Thank you.
American health revolution, still we rise.
Welcome, everyone, to the American Health Revolution podcast. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Richard Margolis. Glad to see you, Richard.
Hi, Paul.
You're back from a vacation, I can tell.
You could tell. I'm tan.
Okay, well, we're putting you right back to work, where I know you're also very comfortable. And we're both very lucky here today to have Jeremy Hammond with us. Jeremy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Sure, appreciate the invitation.
Okay, and one of the reasons we wanted to have you on is because of your tireless work in the field of independent journalism and specifically researching some of the important topics that relate to health in America and one of our cornerstones, which has to do with informed consent. This is your website, Jeremy. I know from having gotten to know you and reading some of your work, Jeremy, that one of the things I love about you is that you're not coming from the left. You're not coming from the right. You're coming from a place where the evidence leads you. And so somebody looking at you objectively, in my opinion, will not be able to tell whether you're from the left or the right, because when we're dealing with human health, we're not interested in that. We're interested in what's in the best interest of our families and our children, right? So would you kindly just spend a moment saying hello to our audience and telling them what it is that brought you into this area of informed consent?
Sure. Well, I got started doing journalism more focused on foreign policy issues, but 2012, I became a father, and that was really kind of the driving force where I began just kind of researching vaccines to be able to make our own informed choices as parents. And that kind of led me down the path of doing journalism on the health freedom issue and basically fighting what I came to recognize as a systematic violation of the right to informed consent that occurs as a result of public vaccine policies. And so I just accumulated this knowledge from doing my own research in the medical literature to the point where I kind of realized like my conscience compelled me where I had this sense that, well, okay, I now have all this knowledge from all this research I've done. Like I can't not share it with other people. And I knew that would put a target on my back, and it required me to kind of shift the focus of my work in ways that my existing audience largely rejected. But it was just something I felt I needed to do, and that's how I kind of got into the whole vaccine issue. It was becoming a father and having to make that choice for those choices for myself, and seeing the violations of the fundamental human right to informed consent being violated, that really got me compelled to start speaking out and writing about this issue.
That's excellent. And so you're driven by conscience, Jeremy, and that I've gotten to know that about you. Richard, you have been working your entire career with families, with children. What message do you have for families today, and how this issue of informed consent has evolved over the last few decades? What is your message to families today regarding informed consent?
You have a need to know about information that your healthcare professional may or may not present to you. And there's a lot of other information out there that's available that you may not know about. But how could we make any choice in life? How could we make a decision unless we have the as much of the available information as we can to decide what the best choice is? And this is something I taught for many years in my career, teaching residents and fellows. I was always very interested in informed consent, and both for the benefit of the patient and the patient's family, and also for the benefit of the physician, because the physician is not only ethically required to provide informed consent, there's a legal requirement to provide informed consent, and that comes out of the Nuremberg trials, that we are required legally to present information to give people informed consent. And I just wanted to add one more thing about Jeremy. Not only is he either on the left or the right, what comes across is that he's writing as a loving father, as a parent, and it comes from the heart as well as his head.
Appreciate
I
that.
could
Yeah,
not agree
if
more.
I could, on the legal aspect of the right to informed consent, of course, there was the Nuremberg Code, which is not technically international law, but there are international treaties that are international law that protect the right to informed consent. And I actually wrote a document that I authored it on behalf of the submitting NGO that was submitted to the UN Human Rights Council, and it is published as a UN General Assembly document detailing how the UN organization and member states were systematically violating these treaties by violating the right to informed consent. So we kind of excoriated the UN and the member states for that violation, and that's a UN document that's on my website.
And
This is going to open up a Pandora's box. Go ahead, Richard.
I can give you the link later.
In general, in my opinion, there's not a whole lot of informed consent going on out there.
No, it's not. There's not. And just to quickly comment on the whole left versus right thing. I mean, you're right. The way I see it, I see the whole idea of this narrow linear spectrum of opinion between left and right as kind of a false paradigm, and I just feel like we all need to transcend that and move past that kind of way of thinking. That's my point of view. So I appreciate that you guys are. And people have confused me. Some, when I write about certain issues, people think, oh, he must be on the right. I write about other issues, and they think he must be on the left. And I'm really neither. I really view that whole paradigm as kind of a misunderstanding of perspectives. I mean, I think we just need to have broader perspectives than that. So
We need to be more mature about it. We need to put those partisan ideals aside,
yeah.
and again focus on the real issues. And I know you do that, Jeremy. I know you do that, Richard. That's what's important to us in American Health Revolution. We're not a political organization. We care about informing people to make the right health decisions for their families. And one of the real problems here, you talked about Nuremberg. is the way things have gone over the last several decades. And I personally attribute this to a commensurate rise in deficit spending in this country over the last, since the early 80s. That this deficit spending has basically been fuel for the dark side. And we now can see, since the 1980s, this rise in profits for healthcare companies and a commensurate decline in the health and well-being of Americans. So we have, profits going this way, stock prices going up, health outcomes coming down. The entire healthcare budget in the United States this year is projected to be $5.5 trillion. That is up from, in the year 2006, 20 years ago, when it was 2.1 trillion approximately. So think about that increase in healthcare spending. Healthcare is the largest and fastest growing sector of the economy. We often refer to GDP as a measure of our economic health. I refer to GDP as grotesque domestic product, because that's really what it's become. We're chasing after all of these chronic diseases that literally did not exist a couple of generations ago, right? Again, deficit spending, fueling the extractionism, fueling the dark side of humanity, taking away the guardrails that keep the greed and the power mongering to a minimum, right? Now, I am going to introduce the concept of vaccines, gentlemen, because that's really, in my view, the poster child for informed consent. There's a long history of vaccines here, and we know that in 1986 there was the Vaccine Act that was introduced under Ronald Reagan. Came from Wyeth and the DTP vaccine that was causing problems, and Reagan said to Wyeth at the time, which is now part of Pfizer, why don't you make these vaccines safe? And of course, we know that vaccines are inherently unsafe. So they changed the whole dynamic of the system. They took away the responsibility of vaccine companies to be held accountable for the products they produce. Right? Once they were given immunity from liability, the whole dynamic changed. Right? Jeremy, would you take a look at this slide and tell us what your experience has been here? Because you've not only written the book on the War on Informed Consent, but you've done a lot of research on the topic, and you've come to some very important conclusions. Would you spend a moment just sharing your thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. So, in my analysis, the intent and effect of the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986 was to effectively shift the financial burden for vaccine injuries away from the pharmaceutical companies and onto the tax-paying consumers. So one of the things that the law did was to establish the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, the VICP, in bullet point 2 there, which is funded by an excise tax that's included in the price of the vaccines. So nominally it's paid by the manufacturers, but in effect it's paid by the consumers, whether through higher premiums, insurance premiums, or through government spending, which of course, where does the government get its money? It gets its money from us. You mentioned the deficit spending. That's a big issue. It ties into the whole monetary system with the Federal Reserve, which is a kind of a different issue, but it certainly ties into it, and the ability of the government to basically spend endlessly by monetizing debt and dollars created out of thin air, which affects this upwards transfer of wealth away from all of us. It defrauds us of our purchasing power, and that's how the government gets away with this endless spending. There's no restrictions essentially on the spending, and that's a big problem because you can't just throw more money. You talked about the healthcare, the increasing spending on healthcare and yet worse outcomes. So throwing more money at the problem isn't fixing the problem. And certainly, laws like the 1986 law are also part of the problem, not the solution. It eliminated the key incentive of the manufacturers to research and develop more effective, safer ways of addressing the problem of infectious diseases. So it basically just eliminated their incentive to try to create, not only just safer and more effective vaccines, but just alternative approaches to vaccination. The entire scientific community and the public health establishment is so myopically focused on vaccines as the solution to infectious diseases, and there's an opportunity cost in the funds that are given to researchers, because of course the government has policies that it wants to uphold, and so it's going to fund the scientists to produce the type of research and results and studies that support the policies, and of course the pharmaceutical industry.
including universities.
Yeah, yes, of course, yes. And so there's this kind of institutionalized bias in terms of the funding that comes with opportunity costs. And an example is, before the and we can pull up graphs of this, but before the measles vaccine was introduced, measles mortality had already plummeted. The vaccine was not responsible for that. So in the years before the vaccine, there was probably around 450 children per year in the U.S. that died of measles. And so the government solution was to say, okay, we're going to have this one size fits all mass measles vaccination, and that's the solution to measles disease. But what about the question of what was different about those children who had complications? Because most children, it was just a rite of passage that most children were fine with measles. They recovered. There were no complications. It was generally a benign illness that you gained lifelong immunity to once you experienced it as a child. So what was different about those children who did have complications and who did die from it? So, there's an opportunity cost here of, okay, the research should have been focused on that question so that we can have individualized interventions for children who might need those interventions, right? But that's not the focus of the research. They're not asking questions like this. They're not interested in individualized medicine and individualized approaches. They have this unscientific, one-size-fits-all approach that is completely indiscriminate. And so, that's what I mean when I'm talking about opportunity costs. It's how much better off could we be today if it wasn't for this myopic focus on pharmaceutical products as the solution.
Sure. And of course, we know that not only is it one size fits all, but they won't engage in anything like immunity testing, right? We're talking about a product that is subject to emergency use authorization, so they don't have to go through the FDA approval process. There's virtually no marketing expense, a captive audience of hundreds of millions of people, right? They get on the schedule, and it's a giant cash cow for these corporations, right? And lo and behold, we have an explosion since that time in 1986. We have an explosion in the vaccine schedule. And I don't know what number we're up to. It says here 88 total doses in 2024. I believe the authorities want that number to increase. Now, I also think we all agree that the current HHS is taking a good hard look at this, and they're evaluating it from the standpoint of which of these vaccines are really necessary. Which ones are extraneous? There's been a lot of discussion, for example, about the Hep B vaccine being given at 1 day old and so forth. And one of the things, Richard, that boggles my mind here, and maybe you guys have some thoughts on this, is the utter lack of long-term randomized safety studies on these products. And from what I understand, and you're the experts here, these products are only measured against other vaccines. The testing is not done in conjunction with other vaccines, so they only evaluate them one at a time typically. And did you know that if an existing drug, let's just pick one like ivermectin, which we all know was improperly demonized, if that drug is determined to be safe and effective at treating the disease that the virus that the vaccine was intended for, that 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 means that the vaccine cannot be developed. So again, incentive, right? The vaccine developers can use, and I'm not saying that ivermectin was the cure all by all means. I'm just trying to point out the incentives here. You know, ivermectin, could it have been used? We don't know. But if it were, then there would have been no money in it because it's an off patent drug, and lo and behold, the vaccines that are being developed with many billions of dollars behind them are going to lose. They're going to lose that cash cow, right? And then we get into the whole idea of the lobby interests and what the lengths they go to buy their way into DC and the propaganda machine and all of these tactics that they're using, right, with their resources. So what thoughts do you guys have about this system and how it undermines credibility and trust and faith? Where do we stand with this today? How do we restore it? Any comments on what I've just shared?
I just want to circle back very briefly to informed consent. One of the most important parts of informed consent is that the individual who's making the decision, the individual patient or the parent for their child, needs to know the potential benefits as well as the potential risks of the intervention and the alternatives too. When you take away product liability, which you described in this 1986 Act, there's no requirement. It takes away the incentive to come up with a safer product. You know, you could think about it. If you remember the Ford Pinto, they had the gas tank in such a place where if the car was involved in a crash, there was a significant risk of the car bursting into flames and burning up. And at that point, the car manufacturer decided, well, it would be we could make more money just selling more Pintos than we would have to pay out in any product liability until they started getting, large lawsuits against them. And guess what? They came up with a much better car, much better design. The same thing holds true for vaccines. As long as product liability, there's no financial incentives for the manufacturers to come up with a better product. I'd love to hear Jeremy's take on this too.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I want to clarify a couple things about the FDA process by which products get to the market. So there's kind of two things. There's one is licensure, which is FDA approval, and then there's the emergency use authorization, the EUA status, which is for investigational experimental products, which is, of course, what the COVID-19 vaccines were initially. They did eventually get full approval, and it is a requirement that under the regulatory apparatus that to get EUA status, that's true, that there cannot be any other product on the market, like ivermectin, for example. If the FDA were to say, oh, ivermectin is approved for treatment of COVID-19 because it's effective, that would automatically disqualify the vaccines from being able to obtain EUA status. And so there was a motive and an incentive. And the government, by the way, was partnered with Moderna in the development of its mRNA vaccine. The government had a financial incentive. The government, NIH scientists own patents involved in the development of these drugs. They get royalties from it. So the government itself is part of the vaccine industry. It's not like the government is regulating the industry. The government practically is the industry, especially since 1986. And so it had this incentive. There was a motive and a financial incentive for the regulatory apparatus to downplay any kind of alternative treatments. And with the end game of the lockdowns from the beginning being this coerced mass vaccination, that was always the end plan was always to be like, we're going to roll out these new vaccines and everyone's going to get vaccinated, and that's going to be our route out of the pandemic. And that was just, again, that was the myopic focus from the very beginning of the lockdowns, which you can go back to the Imperial College report that the lockdowns were basically based on. And it was right in there. It was no secret. It's not a conspiracy theory. They were saying this is what the plan is. And of course, the media reports about 2 weeks to flatten the curve always overlooked that part of the plan. But I was reporting about it back in March and April of 2020, about how this isn't going to be a temporary thing. They're going to maintain these lockdowns semi-permanently until they can roll out a vaccine and coerce it upon everyone. So anyways, there's two different processes. There's full approval or licensure, and then there's emergency use authorization, which is experimental products. And then in terms of safety studies, they don't do long-term studies looking at health outcomes, like long-term health outcomes, especially comparing children who follow the official recommendations compared to children who are completely unvaccinated. Independent researchers have done those types of studies, not completely like CDC schedule versus unvaccinated, but variably vaccinated children versus completely unvaccinated children. I discuss Dr. Paul Thomas's study on that in my book, The War on Informed Consent. And these independent researchers who do these types of vaccinated versus unvaccinated studies, they show that, yes, the data strongly indicate that unvaccinated children are far healthier than their highly vaccinated counterparts. Much lower rates of chronic diseases and disorders, from autoimmune diseases, allergies, neurodevelopmental disorders. There was the Henry Ford health study. Last September, Senator Ron Johnson held a hearing in which Attorney Aaron Seary submitted for the record a study that came out of Henry Ford Health. It was suppressed. It was never published. And the reason why, according to the researcher who was tasked to do the study, so ICANN, the Informed Consent Action Network, approached Dr. Marcus Zervos from Henry Ford Health, an infectious disease specialist there, about doing a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study. And he agreed to do it with the presupposition that it would show that yes, vaccines are beneficial and they're not associated with chronic illnesses. And in his mind, he agreed to do it because in his mind he was thinking, well, this will help to alleviate parental concerns about vaccines. And so he thought that would be the outcome, and so he agreed to do it on those grounds. Turns out,
but that's
actually,
not what
the
happened.
study showed that once again, it showed that the unvaccinated children were far healthier, and he refused to publish it. Why? Well, it's on camera. Del Bigtree, the founder of ICANN and the host of the Highwire, has it on camera of Zervos' admission, I can't publish this or I'll lose my career.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a double standard where any studies that supposedly show the benefits and the safety of vaccines are just uncritically accepted. And observational studies, which are prone to selection biases. You can't do an observational study without risk of selection bias. But the methodology of those studies, if they don't find an association between vaccines and whatever harm, they're just uncritically touted as more proof, absolute determinative proof, unquestionable proof of the safety and effectiveness of vaccines, whereas any study that finds an association between vaccines and harm is much more heavily scrutinized, and any little methodological limitation is cited as a reason to just dismiss the study outright. So there's an absolute double standard in the evaluation and understanding of studies, and especially in how they're reported, whereby there's a sole criterion based on whether a study ought to be considered or rejected, and the simple criterion is, does it support the policy or does it bring the policy into question, and that's the simple
Right.
criterion. And so there's
And
this institutionalized confirmation bias.
100%. And not only do they discredit the studies, but they go out of their way to smear and tarnish and ruin the authors of the studies, or the authors of the books. Now, here's an example of just some of the attempts. It's not just you writing the book War on Informed Consent and the work of Dr. Thomas, but there are many other books that have been written. These are just a few of them. Cheryl Atkinson, for example, is one of our nation's truly phenomenal journalists, not independent like yourself, Jeremy. And I'm personally reading this book right now, COVID-19 and the Global Predators. I think the specific phrase "global predators" carries a lot of weight with me, because as I dig into this topic more and more, it's becoming clear to me that that term does apply. I would have, 5 years ago, I would have looked at that title and said, boy, that's just a conspiracy theory, or something like that, right? But no. I was one of those people, gentlemen, who got in line to get the COVID vaccine. I had a heart condition. I was eligible to get it relatively early, and I did. Uh, if it happened today, I don't know. I might still choose to get that vaccine, weighing the risks and rewards. But I'll tell you what, like most people, the process that I went through had no informed consent attached. It was basically marching to the Pied Piper tune, getting in line. There was no discussion with a doctor, nothing that said, I'm going to put up something I just had before. Nobody said this to me. We're going to be injecting. And now, this is not, I'm not saying this is what was in the COVID vaccine necessarily, but just to give people an idea of what some of the, information that's being withheld from patients it involves. And then we get into, okay, what about vaccine injuries? How are those being recorded? How are they being treated? How are victims and their families being treated? Those who suffer injuries. There was a Harvard study that said somewhere between 1% and 10% of actual adverse events are actually being recorded in the VAERS system. That's part of the reason why we have an explosion in chronic disease in this country, right? So there is a correlation here between the explosion in vaccines, which we showed before, and an increase in chronic disease. Jeremy, you said before, unvaccinated children are generally healthier. The studies have determined that. This is not to suggest that people don't get vaccinated. What it does say, in my opinion, is that we examine the risks and the benefits and recognize the enormous power structure that has created a narrative surrounding informed consent. And again, I hold up vaccines as the poster child of that, because of the nature of vaccinology in America today, right? No evidence of harm is not the same thing as evidence of no harm. The precautionary principle says that it is up to the product developer, the manufacturer, to demonstrate safety and efficacy. It is not up to you or me, the one receiving the jab, to prove that it's unsafe. It's not up to us. And I think this gets back to the accountability issue, and the point you raised about the Ford Pinto, Richard. What is your experience with this in terms of the way that the burden of proof has shifted from the pharmaceutical industry to the patients and their families? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the thousands of ingredients that are put into food, because in our country, we think about these chemicals as generally recognized as safe, GRAS, GRAS, where the burden is not on the the food companies to show that they're safe, the burden is for someone to somehow prove that they're not safe. So all of us are ingesting many, many chemicals that we really don't know are safe. And that's exactly what's happened with vaccines too. How do we know they're safe and who should have that burden? And how should that be explained by healthcare professionals if they have a family history of having a vaccine injury or certain sensitivity to some of the products within the vaccines? Uh, they should know all that before deciding whether or not a vaccine has a benefit for them that's greater than the risk. And the reality is that doctors don't know all the chemicals that are in vaccines either.
We're going to get to that, Richard. That's an important point, and I think that really comes into play with the American Association of Pediatrics. This is a quote from a book written by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the current HHS secretary, and it lets us know in no uncertain terms where the priority is, right? Uh, it is not for them about health, it is about profit. And I will tell you that my opinion is we're going to have to figure this out, guys, as a country, as a nation. We're going to have to take a good, long, hard look at where is the incentive structure? How do we properly incentivize innovation, research, treatments, right? Because if we prioritize profits to such a degree, prioritize stock returns to such a degree that the human condition is being basically pillaged, and not just physical health, but emotional health, spiritual health. I mean, there's all kinds of prices being paid by the American public here. And so we have to really examine this. I mentioned before, Jeremy, that $5.5 trillion in healthcare spending in 2026 is the anticipated number. Only 5% of that number is being allocated to research and to cures, right? The rest is going to treatments. It's going into, procedures, surgeries, administration, right? And and lo and behold, we have uh, we have this chart to show here. Towards Healthcare estimates the size of the oncology market going from under $300 billion today to $748 billion in 10 years, less than 10 years. Now, what does that tell us? That tells us that they're not looking to reverse cancer. They're not looking to do the research to prevent it, to cure it. They want to treat it because there's money in treatments. Even companies like Merck and Pfizer have announced in their quarterly reports that they're actively moving their business, much of their business model, toward the oncology treatment market because that's where the money is.
And just to add to that, the big pharmaceutical companies spend much more on advertising than they do on research and development.
Only in this country, right? New
Oh,
Zealand does a little bit as well, but we're the only country in the world that allows TV advertising of pharmaceutical products. And I'll add that there's an increasing amount being devoted to uh, advertising in social media as well. A tremendous amount of money going into companies like Facebook, and they're really and they're trying to get to people while they're young. The younger they can create a lifetime customer, the better off they're going to be. A model that, tobacco used to use, right? We know that. We hold, Jeremy, and I want to hear your thoughts, please. I'll turn it over to you momentarily. Uh, we tend to think of Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, as the bad guys, right? That they're sort of the exception to the rule of an otherwise, stellar industry the health and well-being of Americans at heart. But you know what? Purdue Pharma is not the exception. They're basically the poster child for an industry that has been, reckless and treats these issues that come up and the fines that they pay simply as the cost of doing business. These are fines that have been paid over the last 25 years or so. And these are just civil fines. 99% of this money is just settlements, and so I look at this and I say, they're not the good guys. They're not the good guys. They're not. They're not. There's always going to be some benefit. Like I said, I might take the vaccine again if in the same situation with COVID, but the manner in which it's being done is really something that I think needs to be brought into question. So, what are your thoughts here, my friend?
I just wanted to add that there are some medicines that are very helpful. You have a bad infection and you need an antibiotic. There are good antivirals out on the market too that save people's lives. So you go into the emergency room and you get treated on an emergency basis because you have a life-threatening condition. Those are very important things, and we need those drugs. It's not as if all drugs are bad, but the reality is that nothing is totally safe and nothing is totally effective. And by saying something is safe and effective, it's just not true. And everybody goes to the doctor, to the healthcare provider, expecting an unbiased opinion of what is in their best health interest. But that would require healthcare providers to really look at their own biases. And it's not an easy process to look at everything that you've been taught and to question it all and to realize a lot of what you've learned is just not accurate, and it's not, and you need that you're responsible for providing information to your patients that show both sides of the story, but they need to understand that their whole training has been biased towards interventions because that's how they get paid.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Jeremy, I know you have some thoughts on this, including the AAP, but I'll let you take it wherever you want to go.
Yeah, well, I have so many thoughts on some of these things. I want to go back a little bit to the question of ingredients, and again, bringing it back to the question of informed consent. So we have safe and effective. We're supposed to believe vaccines are safe and effective. This is a PR slogan. It's not a meaningful description of the product, and it really highlights the fundamental problem, which is that every vaccine needs to be an individualized risk-benefit analysis for every child and every vaccine, because every individual has a different risk profile for themselves in terms of what are the odds of this child being exposed to this pathogen. What are the odds of this child having complications from an infection? What are the odds of this child having adverse reactions to the vaccine or being injured by the vaccine? I mean, every individual is different. And this idea that we all have exactly the same biology, I mean, it's absurd. It's ridiculous. And I mean, one of the things that is really overlooked is, we can bring up the autism issue and the controversy about it, and they claim that, well, studies have proven that vaccines are not associated with autism. But if you look at the studies that the CDC will say, and not one of them even considered, and the Institute of Medicine pointed this out. Of course, the CDC's webpage that says, vaccines do not cause autism. They cite the Institute of Medicine. You go read the Institute of Medicine's report in their review. And what do they say? Well, none of the studies actually considered the possibility of genetically susceptible subpopulations of children. Okay, so they didn't test the hypothesis. Therefore, the hypothesis cannot possibly have been falsified. All right, so this is one of the things that people overlook, is that the limited nature. Again, there's methodological limitations in all of these studies that we're supposed to believe have disproven the hypothesis. But actually, if you look at what those limitations are, they cannot possibly claim that the hypothesis has been falsified. And the Institute of Medicine pointed this out. The Institute of Medicine didn't conclude that, oh, well, these studies have disproven the hypothesis. They said, no, they favor the rejection of the hypothesis. Why? Well, none of them were actually designed to even consider the possibility of susceptible subpopulations. With more traditional vaccines in terms of ingredients, of course, historically you had mercury, thimerosal, the mercury-based preservative, which was withdrawn from most vaccines around the turn of the century. Why? Well, they'll tell you, oh, it was just a precautionary measure that the CDC and the AAP decided to make that decision just purely out of a precautionary principle. That's completely false. The truth is that throughout the 90s, the CDC's schedule was exposing infants to cumulative levels of mercury in excess of the government's own safety guidelines. And the fact that nobody had even bothered to ask the question within the government regulatory apparatus in the CDC or the FDA, nobody had bothered to even ask the question of whether adding more and more mercury-containing vaccines to the schedule would be safe for infants. It wasn't even a consideration until the late 90s, when by accident Congress tasked the FDA to query industries about mercury exposure. And of course, one of the industries in products, the mercury use in products. And so one of the industries that of course used mercury in products was the vaccine industry. And so by accident, the FDA obtained these lists of the amounts of mercury in vaccines, and they, because of this congressional task to do this, they finally came around to doing the calculations. And this was like 1998 before they finally got around to doing it. And then they realized, oh my gosh, that the cumulative amounts of mercury that infants are being exposed to exceeds our own safety guidelines. And so that's the true reason why they made the decision to withdraw thimerosal from most childhood vaccines. But at the same time, of course, it was still included in multi-dose vials of influenza vaccines, which they started recommending for infants as young as 6 months old and for pregnant women. And of course, aluminum is another big problem, that many vaccines contain aluminum, which is used as an adjuvant to essentially cause a more inflammatory immune response and downstream production of antibodies, which is necessary for the vaccine manufacturers to obtain licensure. So, because a lot of times, that's what the requirement is they have to show that that it has a certain immunological effect. And the FDA for some vaccines actually uses antibody titers or measurements in the blood as a surrogate measure of immunity. This is true for the pertussis vaccine, where they haven't shown that actually a certain level of antibodies actually correlates to immunity, but they just take an arbitrary level and they say, well, okay, if the product can cause the body to produce this level of antibodies, we're going to equate that with immunity. It's a surrogate measure. And aluminum, of course, and mercury both being known neurotoxins. And so the ingredients are problematic, and the safety claims are problematic. And you can look at just compare the CDC's claims with its own cited sources that it uses to claim safety. And we can talk more about that, but I want to kind of get through to these other points that, including the AAP that we kind of covered. And then with the mRNA vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines, of course, are a different type of product. But, you look at, again, the informed consent question, look at how those products were sold to the public. What were people told? They were told, number one, that, your natural immunity is insufficient. So even if you already recovered from COVID, you need to get the vaccines. That wasn't true. And then they said that, if you need these vaccines to be able to stop infection and transmission, this is how we get to herd immunity. That wasn't true. The vaccines weren't designed to stop infection and transmission, because with a respiratory virus, the way you get what's called sterilizing immunity, which is what stops infection and transmission of the virus, is through what's called mucosal immunity. And with natural infection, the route of exposure is your respiratory tract. And so you get the mucosal immunity with natural infection and natural immunity. It's better immunity. The vaccines bypass that. They didn't confer mucosal immunity. That's why they didn't stop infection and transmission. Every doctor From Fauci on down, everyone who was saying that these vaccines are going to confer durable sterilizing immunity, get 2 doses, and then that we're going to have herd immunity, they all knew better. I mean, this is basic immunology. They all knew better. They were deliberately lying. In fact, Fauci later wrote a paper, of course, after the data proved that the vaccines don't stop infection and transmission. And Fauci came out and he wrote a paper in a journal article saying how, well, yeah, because these vaccines don't confer mucosal immunity, they weren't designed to do that. And so we need better vaccines that are capable of doing that. I mean, they knew. And so you just look at the level of deception. Why does this deception happen? Well, it's because here's the thing. Public vaccine policy is not about educating people to be able to make their own informed choice. That's not the policy goal. The policy goal is to increase vaccination rates. That's it. They start from the premise that we need to have high vaccination rates, so they're begging the question. And then all the policies follow from that policy goal. And so if that means having to exaggerate
Jeremy,
benefits and
downplay
question,
risk. So does that, excuse me for interrupting, does that subvert public health in and of itself, the policy goal of having high vaccination rates?
Yes, absolutely. It perverts everything from the practice of medicine to scientific research. Because they start with a policy goal, they start with what they're making an assumption, and just like they assumed that that achieving high vaccination rates would result in a healthy childhood population. Well, we can see in the data that assumption was false. It's simply false. More vaccines does not equal healthy children, and we know that. That's not a question. We know that that's false, and so they make these presumptions, these arrogant presumptions, and they assume things. So, and they don't look at things like, okay, well, they don't consider superior natural immunity as an opportunity cost. So, for example, with measles, some of the consequences of mass measles vaccination have been mothers now are less able to confer passive maternal immunity to infants. So infants, in the event of an outbreak, are at higher risk from measles now than they were in the pre-vaccine era. Things like this. So the risk can shift in ways that are really detrimental. They don't consider, how the measles vaccine, although very effective, it's probably one of the most effective vaccines, if not the most effective one that we have, the measles vaccine. It does stop infection and transmission. It's very effective for that, which you can see in the data, because even though mortality rates had plummeted already before the vaccine, the incidence had not, and the incidence didn't plummet until after the vaccine. So it is effective, but it's not as good as natural immunity. And so, by mass vaccinating, it does wane. And so there's something called there's vaccine failure. There's primary vaccine failure, which is some people just don't develop the immune response from the vaccine. And so when you hear, well, it has 95% effectiveness, what that means is about a certain percentage of people who get the 2 doses of the vaccine, they don't develop the level of antibodies that's considered protective. But then there's also secondary vaccine failure, which is basically waning immunity. And so, natural immunity to measles was considered lifelong, both because of the robustness of the immune response and also because of re-exposure. And so that would be a kind of a natural booster. And so because of the vaccine being effective at preventing transmission, people aren't exposed to it. And the vaccine just doesn't confer as robust an immunity as natural infection. So those two factors together mean that later in life, you're going to be at higher risk of measles infection when it's more dangerous to you, as opposed to in childhood when it's less dangerous to you. And so there are all of these other factors, like natural immunity as an opportunity cost, is my point here, that you have to consider. That by getting the vaccine, you're foregoing the opportunity to gain the superior immunity of natural infection. That's an opportunity cost. They don't consider that. They don't consider also unintended consequences of the vaccines, and they have what's called there's a term for it in the literature. It's non-specific effects of vaccines, which are off-target effects. So the target effect of the measles vaccine is would reduce the risk of measles disease. Okay, that's the specific intended effect of the vaccine. But they can have unintended effects. For example, the DTP vaccine is the best example of this because the studies have shown that the diphtheria, tetanus, and whole cell pertussis vaccine, far from protecting children from the risk of dying, is actually associated with an increased rate of childhood mortality. And the explanation for this by the researchers who have done most of this research is that it has, even though it might protect them from the three target diseases, it has detrimental effects on their immune system that actually makes them more susceptible to other diseases. And so they're dying at an even greater rate from other causes.
All
So
cause
there's
mortality goes up. Yeah.
so you have to look at all-cause mortality, and of course they don't do that with the vaccine safety study. So they make this assumption again that they have this a priori assumption where they say, okay, well we have high vaccination rates, and that's going to protect children from death. That's an assumption. It was never studied. They never tested that hypothesis before they implemented the policy. Because to test that hypothesis, you would actually have to look at all-cause mortality long term. And they don't do those studies. They never did. And they won't do them now because, again, they have to maintain. The policy is more important than children's health. And that's why children are so unhealthy. So there's all kinds of perversion and perverse.
This is earth shattering information. This is 5 alarm existential threat to humanity type of information, in my opinion, Jeremy, that you're sharing. And we can talk and try to kind of inform people, but hold on, folks. Let's stop in our tracks and let's recognize the importance here. Because the incentive structure is misaligned to the public interest in this industry. And Jeremy is here as an independent researcher, and Richard concurs, I'm sure, with everything he's saying, that this is something that we, the people, from a grassroots perspective, must take action on. And it's not enough to simply ask your doctor, is this vaccine safe? We have to go the extra yard. We have to say, okay, what's in the vaccines? What studies can you show me that demonstrate the risks and benefits? What about my child's genotype? All of these other questions that have simply been ignored because people inherently trust their doctors. They inherently trust the AAP, the CDC, the NIH, all of these agencies. And guess what? That trust seems to be, I don't want to use the word because I don't think it applies to everyone in the industry or everyone in the agencies, Jeremy, but I think by and large, the public trust has been betrayed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Also, if you ask your doctor some of those very good questions, the answer will be, well, we don't know. Because the studies haven't been done. We can't give you that information about your child's specific genome and how he or she might react to the vaccination. And that, for me, then the question is, well, why aren't these studies being done? Because if we truly want a world where we have individualized healthcare and medicine, we need to start looking at that.
In our 100%, couldn't agree more, Richard. In our next episode, we're going to go into some of those studies. We're going to go into the Paul Thomas study, the Verstraeten study, the Ford study you mentioned with Del Bigtree. We'll talk about some of those things. We'll talk about the AAP. We'll talk deeper about the incentive structure. And the purpose of this is to really bring light to a system that is deeply corrupt and needs to change from within. But again, folks, I urge everyone here, this is a grassroots requirement for our children, for our children's health. We know that 194 million adults in this country, something like 74% of adults, are suffering with a chronic condition. Okay, this is an important calling, and I urge everyone to join in, ask the questions, take action, and read up. Jeremy's got the goods there. There's his website. Learn from him. He shared a tremendous amount of valuable information today, Jeremy. I know there's probably more you want to talk about. I'll ask you if you have any concluding comments, because we'll wrap it up here shortly and have another episode so that people have time to digest all of this information that we've been throwing at them today.
Paul, if I could just make a brief comment.
Please do. Yes.
I want viewers to understand that it's not that we're against medications. We're not
Yes.
for medications. We're not against vaccines. We're not for vaccines. We're for informed consent, and for everyone out there that's listening to have all the information that you deserve to make the best decision you can for yourselves and your loved ones.
Beautifully stated, Richard. I could not agree more. Jeremy, any concluding thoughts?
I also concur and want to. I'm glad you're emphasizing that point because, there's this term anti-vaxxer. Merriam-Webster actually did us the favor of defining an anti-vaxxer as someone who, is opposed to vaccine mandates. So that's what it really means. It's a euphemism for someone who is an informed consent advocate. So it's really important to stress that, I think. And I'll just have a couple. I'll make it as brief as I can, just to
Please
up on a couple of
take your time.
So we mentioned AAP and trust in doctors. Well, the AAP is a pharma-funded organization, transparently so. You can go to their website and go to their funders page, and they list all the vaccine manufacturers who they get funding from. We talked about advertising dollars of there's direct to consumer marketing in the United States, but that completely also overlooks, not to mention the fact that the taxpayers subsidize research, development, advertising, marketing, distribution of vaccines. Again, the government doesn't oversee the vaccine industry. The government is the vaccine industry. And all of this is taxpayer subsidized. So that it saves, billions and billions of dollars. It saves for the pharmaceutical industry because we're paying for it, because the government is involved in all of this subsidization, and that it does it, again, the NIH will develop patents using taxpayer dollars to do research and development, and then licensing the patents to the vaccine manufacturers. And then the scientists who developed it get royalties from that. And we're still working in the NIH. So there's all of this corruption and conflicts of interests. So again, the government is the problem here. And then also, those were the kind of final thoughts I think I had. Oh, one other thing, on the VAERS, you had mentioned VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which was also established under the 1986 law. And you mentioned the underreporting, and that's one of the big issues. And of course, this goes into the gaslighting of parents, where parents will vaccinate their child, the child has an adverse reaction, and the doctors will reject that and say, no, it couldn't possibly be from the vaccines, and they don't report it, even though they're supposed to. By law, they're supposed to, but the underreporting of adverse events to VAERS is a known problem in the literature. It's a big, huge problem, and of course, post-marketing surveillance is not a substitute for properly designed, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials, and so the proper studies are just not done. So anyways, those are some of the final thoughts I had to wrap up. Just kind of go back to some of the points that you guys were making earlier.
And we can delve into those again more next time, because again, I think we did largely a 10,000 foot surface view of a lot of this stuff, and we can get into it more. But I'm really glad you concluded with the thought about the gaslighting of parents, Jeremy. That is the one thing that really drew me into this movement, into American Health Revolution, because I've spoken to countless families who, whether it be, vaccine leading directly to autism, or a SIDS death, or, it's just some serious adverse event. And the way these families have gotten treated, it's like, okay, you're experiencing this vaccine injury, and now you're being gaslit and told you're crazy, and the doctors are telling you it has nothing to do with it. I mean, this is the one thing that really, really drew me in, because I said, you know what, this is families and children being treated more like lab rats than patients. And Um, and I hate saying that. I've been the beneficiary of some great medical advances. I've had surgery that saved my life. You know, and and yet it's not about those doctors. It's about the institution, right? It's about the corrupt, institutionalized approach here. And so with that, gentlemen, I want to thank you for your incredible work, heartfelt, knowledgeable, patient first, community first. That's what we're about here at American Health Revolution. And so with that, I look forward to doing this again soon. We'll look forward to doing part two, and hopefully, bring to light some important information. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Look forward to it.